Hello and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm your host, Park Howell, and I want to thank you for listening to this episode because today you will meet a storytelling guru from down under who will show you how to harvest and share your everyday stories for amazingly big, remarkable, incredible results. A couple of weeks ago, I was spilling my morning coffee down the front of me as I sat in my easy reading chair in front of a roaring fire because, well, it was 16 degrees outside in northern Arizona. I was reading Seth Godin's daily email as I do most mornings, and in this particular one, he was announcing the late May launch of his new book, The Song of Significance. Now, if you haven't heard of Seth Godin, he essentially is one of America's foremost marketing experts with, something in the neighborhood of 20 best-selling books. His Purple Cow book on branding is one of my all-time favorites. Anywho, on a whim, sitting there in my now coffee-splattered Ben Folds concert t-shirt, I sent Seth an email inviting him onto this show to promote his new book. Well, I was astonished when Seth responded within minutes. He not only agreed to come onto our show, which we've already recorded and will air the last week of May when his new book comes out, but Seth recommended that I interview today's guest, Bernadette Jiwa. So many of us think that we have to tell epic tales to interest our audience and to make us sound interesting. Well, Bernadette suggests to think small, telling everyday stories with delightful details. Because as we all know, the power of compelling storytelling rests not in the size of your story, but in the specifics of its telling.
One of the greatest storytellers I knew growing up was Billy Connolly, the Scottish comedian. His skill is just to reflect back to you in real life how a drunk looks walking back from the pub with a packet of fish and chips under his arm. Just being able to convey that in a way that we go, yeah, that is us. We can laugh at ourselves. So that ability to notice is important. And that gets to one of my other tips. It's about specificity. It's really nailing those small details that make your story come alive. That specificity that he does with the fish and chips and the gate and those kinds of little details that really make a story come alive.
Bernadette Jiwa is the creator of the Story Skills Workshop, which has taught thousands of people to harness the power of their everyday stories. Her 8 best-selling books are modern classics on mastering the art of storytelling to persuade, influence, and inspire so that you can increase your impact in the world. She was named by Smart Company as one of Australia's top business thinkers and listed as one of the top branding experts to follow on Twitter. Bernadette is trusted by leaders from the likes of Disney, UNICEF, Louis Vuitton, Adidas, United Nations, Red Cross, Microsoft, Google, Lego, and so many more. Her book, Meaningful, The Story of Ideas That Fly, was featured in Inc. magazine's Best Business Books of 2015. Her previous books have been included on LinkedIn's 20 Books Every Marketer Should Read. But Bernadette hasn't been resting on her laurels because just last year, her debut novel, The Making of Her, was published by Penguin Random House in the U.S. and Australia. Today, we'll examine storytelling concepts from Bernadette's book, What Great Storytellers Know, The 7 Skills to Become Your Most Inspiring and Influential Self. And she'll walk you through how to use her 5-step storytelling scaffold. So please welcome to the Business of Story, and thank you, Seth, for recommending Bernadette Jiwa. Bernadette, welcome to the Business of Story.
It's such a thrill to be speaking to you. I'm a fan of the podcast. I've listened for ages. And when Seth Godin introduced us, I thought the stars had aligned.
Oh, that's so cool. I didn't know you were an ongoing listener. Thank you so much for that. And yes, I got a chance to interview Seth last week We had a fantastic conversation, and it will be coming out at the end of May when his new book is coming out. And in the process, excuse me, of getting him set up for the interview, he mentioned you, and I have been following your work and the work you've been doing with him. And so I was just delighted. I kind of got a twofer out of the deal. I got him on board, and then he sent you my way. So I'm so glad you're here with me today. How did you get into storytelling in the first place?
There's a long answer to that, and there's a short answer. But the short answer, I guess, is that I am from the storytelling capital of the world. I was born in Dublin, Ireland. And my friend Michael Bungay-Stanier likes to say that he thinks there's a secret breeding program for storytellers in Ireland, much like the Jamaicans have for sprinters. You know, we pop out storytellers and have a secret breeding program.
I think it's called Guinness beer. I think that's what it is, Guinness beer.
Yeah, I've never had a pint of Guinness in my life, but I'll take your word for it that it's fabulous.
Oh, you are missing out.
Apparently the Dublin Guinness is better than the rest of the world. Anyway, so I was born in Dublin into a very working class family, and I grew up in a house without any books. And that didn't mean there weren't any stories. There was a lot of storytelling around the kitchen table. At a time, I was born in the 60s, so the front door was always open, and you get characters, you get neighbors in and out. There was always stories around the kitchen table, often cautionary tales, I would have to say. So that was my first introduction to storytelling, and I didn't become a writer until many decades later.
Often cautionary tales. Isn't that interesting? Do you think we Homo sapien storytelling apes default to cautionary tales because it helps ensure our survival?
I think so. I can imagine us around the campfire talking about the berries we not to eat and the animals not to poke with a stick. So I think so, definitely.
So what is your business background, or how did you get into then becoming a very sought-after business consultant relative to storytelling?
So in my 40s, I discovered blogging as an aside to, it was a complementary, a marketing strategy for my coaching business. I was a small business coach at the time. And I was gathering stories, everyday stories about small businesses. I started blogging. I'd found Seth Godin at that point. I read his brilliant book, Purple Cow, about remarkability. And
one of my favorites.
He was the first ever blog that I followed and still follow to this day, and started blogging and it's got a following. Because I think people were hungry, small business owners were hungry at that point for stories about them. They wanted to see themselves reflected in some of the content that was out there. That's when blogs were in vogue, of course. 2010, 2011 is when I started. And on the back of that, I published a book, which won an award here in Australia, where I'm now based. And it just exploded from there. I got to work with Seth Godin on a couple of fabulous projects. And
you were fairly new to this. How did that come about that you got to work with Seth?
Very new to this. Seth and I were pen pals, I think, for about 5 years. I used to get his blog and email him. And then one day I got this email from him, which the subject line was RFP. And I've never been to business school, so I didn't know what RFP meant. So I had to go to Google and Google it before I opened the email. And he asked me, he sent me this lovely email which said, I don't know of anybody else who's read my blog as deeply as you have. And I'm putting together this book a compilation book of I forget how many years it was of the blog. Would you be interested in helping me to collate it? Sort of like a developmental edit, really, we would call it if we were looking at, professional editing service. And of course, you don't need to ask anybody twice if they want to work with the brilliant Seth Godin. So I said yes, even though I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. And we had a fabulous month together working on this big behemoth book that he put out at that time. And the rest, as they say, is history. We're firm friends now. We've, in 2019, through his Akimbo organization, which he used to lead at that time, we launched the Story Skills Workshop. And that's been life-changing for more than 5,000 people, that workshop. I'm super proud of it, super proud of the work we've done together.
That is awesome. I got to ask you, what does RSP mean? I don't even know if I know that. I don't know that. RFP, request for proposal. Oh, RFP. Oh, I got you. Okay.
RFP.
I got you.
RFP.
Well, how exciting is that? I want to go back to your blog. So you were starting to write this. And do you feel like these stories about small businesses that really attracted these businesses in, did they just come naturally to you? I mean, it didn't take a lot of strategic planning, like, oh, I'm going to set aside all my bullet points and my stats and charts and graphs, and I'm just going to lead with story?
Well, I think the advantage I had there at Park was I didn't go to business school. I didn't go have any official marketing training. I went to the School of Life, I guess, and that was refreshing. I wasn't looking at data. I wasn't looking at any of that. I hadn't advertised. It was all organic. So it was very word of mouth. And they were stories, they were everyday stories that I was seeing of businesses trying and failing and just watching, just looking, being, which is one of my greatest storytelling tips, is be where you are, being present in the moment, which is getting harder and harder these days, but that is a great way to mine your stories.
Yeah, I've just got done reading a book that you might find interesting if you haven't already read it. It's called Stolen Focus by Johan Harari. And he did, a tremendous amount of studying around the world and interviewing people from around the world about what in the world has happened to our attention and our lack of attention span. And, it's a lot of it, of course, is you can chalk it up to food, to diet, to exercise, to our pollutants in the environment. But one of course, the main things is the ad tech world, social media, and how these technological behemoths, Facebook, Instagram, Google, you name it, have completely hacked our attention spans. And so it is really hard for people to be in the moment right now. And I don't know, at least for me, when I'm teaching storytelling, I'm a big believer that story, of course, was the very first technology that we Homo sapiens used to understand and make meaning in the world around us and to survive and evolve and everything else. And it is still that storytelling that is the most powerful technology to overcome what is happening to us in the world, to our subconscious with the ad tech world, with the Googles of the world and so forth. And so it is in story that we find this meaning, and we can still command the attention of that person, that Homo sapiens storytelling ape sitting across from us.
It's funny that you say that. I was thinking about task switching and how often we do that during our day. We could be working on a document or doing some writing and still have our email pinging at the side of us. And last week, I now run a community for the alumni of the Story Skills Workshop at Story Republic. And last week we had a storytelling event, and I came away from that event just feeling so calm and relaxed. And I thought, what is this feeling that's in my body? And it was just this feeling of having given way to paying attention to the stories and being in the moment and being present. And I just thought, wow, I felt like I'd done a yoga class or something, and I was listening to stories.
There's mindfulness to storytelling, isn't there, whether you are the teller or the receiver? And you've talked about the power of everyday stories, and I just think that's a marvelous subject for today's episode because, and I imagine you probably get this too from some of your workshop folks, when they come to you and say, Bernadette, I don't have any stories to tell. I'm not a good storyteller. Nobody wants to hear my stories. And probably the last thing those people are going to believe is there actually power in the everyday stories that you experience and can capture and share. Can you share with us a little bit about how you use stories, these everyday stories, for impact?
Well, what we do in that instance is we just encourage people to tell the smallest story they can tell. So we say because I think that's the challenge. We are looking at, the Steve Jobs of the world, or, the people that we think are the gifted storytellers. And I firmly believe that storytelling is not a gift. It's a skill that we can practice. And we've gotten out of the practice of doing it because we're so much in our phones, or in the digital world, we spend a lot of our time alone. So I think that ability to practice is really important. And the kinds of stories we encourage people to tell at first are what's the smallest story you can tell? And when they get over that hump of having to tell the big life story as a whole, I'll give you an example. One of the best stories we've had in the workshop that connected with a lot of people was a mom in a car taking her son for a burger to a drive-through, and they were having this argument, and how she navigated that argument in that moment, and how it ended up with them reconciling in the car. So just telling that small story. So I say to people, start there. Start with, there I was, and be in that moment. So if you think about what a story is, the simplest definition is a story is a character in a situation faced with a choice that results in a change. And those things, those changes happen in moments throughout our day. It's not just the moment when you're faced with a crisis, like let's say a health scare or something like that. It can be moment to moment, something that happened in a conversation with your kids or your partner or a neighbor. Tiny things that make our lives significant.
It's interesting that you say moment, because when I come across people and they say, Park, I'm not good at this storytelling thing. I don't really want to learn the story. I don't even know how to do it. I say, well, don't tell a story. Just take us to a moment in time when something happened and something changed. And I know you and I are big believers in stories are always about change. Change is conflict or contradiction. If you have no conflict and change, you really don't have a story. But I just say, take us to a moment when this happened, what happened, where were you, and what was that sort of surprising outcome or that aha moment that led to a learning. And the more I thought about that, I thought, man, I now lead a lot of my trainings with the idea of, think about this as moment training, sharing moments. And the root word for moment is momentum, which I find interesting, because with momentum, you think of a body in action. It's got inertia. It's moving somewhere. You have momentum. It is energy taking you someplace. And yet you think about a moment in time is when something is captured and it's still and it's not moving. And yet, when you tell that little anecdote about that moment in time when everything changed and what you learned by that, it takes on its own energy or its own momentum for your audience. I just thought that was a really fascinating study of the word moment and momentum.
Yeah, and a great way, fabulous way to ground your participants in the idea for you, in your trainings, that they don't need to tell this huge story to create impact. You can create, I talk to people about the smallest viable story. If it's got those elements, and it happened to you today in this moment. So that's one of the things we encourage people to do, is like, there's a story out there today. Go back to your day and find it.
But you have to have a point to that story, right? Because I can hear people right now saying, okay, Park and Bernadette, that's great, but I'm just not going to go around rifling off these little everyday stories. You have to have a point or a reason or a strategy behind the telling of that story, right?
Well, I think if you've got, some people who come to us, you and I, Park, want to tell stories for their business. Some people who come to me want to leave stories behind for their grandkids, or they want to do it as part of their marketing strategy. They want to tell it as part of a leadership strategy. They're activists, or they're scientists or artists, and they want to anchor their marketing or their outreach to their audience in story. So it depends on the audience that you're speaking to. If you're speaking to your kids, it's a different thing to if you're speaking to your business partners. Yeah, your intention for your stories matters, and your story. The other thing is, stories are about connecting. They're about getting to know each other and speaking with confidence from the heart and being empathetic to each other, and also about being present in your own life too. Storytelling is a gift to your audience, but it's also a gift to yourself.
It really is, and I apologize for stepping on you there. I know you're coming to us from Melbourne, Australia, right? And I'm coming to you from northern Arizona, and believe it or not, Bernadette, I'm still operating off of DSL up here. Now, I've got Elon Musk's Starlink out there, but we have a tremendous blizzard going through, so I can't rely on Starlink. So I get a little bit of this choppiness, so my apologies there. But
okay.
You've got this story structure or this story scaffolding that you teach. Can we dive into that a little bit? What is it, and what can our viewers, listeners take away on how they could start using it immediately in their worlds?
Well, I have a visual, if that helps. I can hold that up.
Let's try
I know
it.
You're starting with video, so let's hold it up. Since we're not sharing screen, it looks a bit like that.
Okay.
So you can see these boxes, right? So
and would you send me a PDF of that I could put in the show notes? Let's do that too, so people could go over there and take a look at it. Great.
I will. Once they have this, once anybody has this, they have everything they need to tell a story, because it talks about how stories have beginning, middle, and end, and what happens at each stage of the story. So in the beginning of the story, so I talk about the 5 C's of storytelling: context, catalyst, complication, change, and consequence. The context, catalyst, complication, change, and consequence. So the context is the backstory, introduction to the hero's world, as who's there, where is it happening, something brief. I was sitting at my desk doing my emails, and this email popped up, and it was, and the catalyst, it was an email from Seth Godin. So that's the catalyst, the event. Something changes in the hero's world or the heroine's world. We have, in our workshop, we have 2 variants of this. Then the complication, the hero is faced with a problem and a choice. That's the complication. The change, the transformation. The hero decides on a path and a plan to overcome the obstacle. And the consequence, the resolution, the hero's character, fate, world, and worldview are altered.
Interesting.
So
where did the scaffolding come from? Is this from your own work, or how did you come up with this?
It dropped into my head. That's all I can tell you. I was working on the story skills workshop. I went to Seth and I said, "Look, you've got these fabulous workshops on marketing and freelancing, and he's such an advocate for storytelling. How about one on story skills?" I feel like storytelling has been co-opted almost as a marketing activity, or as something that only people who have skills as writers can do. And I feel very strongly that we need to democratize storytelling again. And so I spoke to Seth about doing it. And then I had to go away and build a workshop and create the lessons. So I think it was that, when you have that extreme focus and ideas come to you in that time. So I had to sit down and re-engineer what I was doing as a storyteller so that I could teach it to other people. And that's how it came about.
You know, my path in storytelling began in the early 2000s when I was running my ad agency in Phoenix, Arizona, and I was trying to figure out a better way, a foolproof way, if you will, to be able to connect in the very noisy world of the internet, and came across The Hero's Journey, of course, and it's 12 or 17 steps, depending on who you read. And when I saw it, I thought, this is brilliant story strategy for big stories, epic stories, and so forth. And I wrote my first book, Brand Bewitchery, taking that and boiling it down to 10 steps that business people could understand. Had to kind of take it out of the Hollywood jargon, put it into the business logical reason brain, and take them through it. But it's complex. It's very effective, but it's complex, and it's 10 steps. And, of course, I studied the 15 beats of Blake Snyder's, to every story of Blake Snyder, Save the Cat, the Pixar way, 7 or 8 beats there and whatever. And it really, everything that I learned boiled down to those 3 steps of the and, but, therefore. Set up problem resolution, or building that narrative intuition, because I found I was confusing my audiences when I was leading with the big thinking, the complex stuff. So I start with the foundation and build from there. With your 5 C's, do you ever have that problem? Do you get people that sit down and go, okay, I think I get it. Bernadette, you are a professional storyteller. You've been doing it your whole lives, but I'm just having a hard time getting through this. Have you found a way to make it very easily digestible for them?
I think just by sitting down with that and having an outline. So we also have in the workshop an outline document, which is literally that document with notes underneath. And once you have that, you're away, because you're just writing 2 sentences. You don't need to go in at first to, say, I'm going to write 1,000 words about this. Or if I want to tell a story, I can just give 2 sentences to each of those. So I think what we've done really well is lead people down a path and hold their hands while they do it. But I defy anyone to say that that's complex. I agree with you. It's what you're saying is echoing what I was saying. I went to see the brilliant. I went to a workshop with the brilliant Robert McKee, author of Story, in New York, and he was doing a business storytelling workshop based on his tome, which is Story, which I was introduced to by my son. The
Storynomics, I think, is what you're talking about.
He had Storynomics, but he's also got a big tome, which is Story. I'm envious of just having Story as your title for your book.
Yeah.
And that was really for screenwriters, because he's a phenomenal reputation for teaching screenwriters. But it's dense. There's a lot in that. So I think the advantage you and I have is that we've studied broadly, and that's helped us to crystallize and digest everything and help us to crystallize story to its essence, really.
I've got an everyday story relative to him that I went to his story conference at the Sheraton LAX back in, I think it was 2009 or 2010, with our son, who's a filmmaker. I gave it to him for Christmas and said, I'm coming along too, because I thought I wanted to go in as a marketer.
Fabulous.
And it was fascinating. It was such an eye-opener for me to understand the big picture of screenwriting, Hollywood, and storytelling. And, it's a legendary 3-day conference, and he owns that stage, and it is complete and utter performance art when he's up there. Not only is he brilliant, but he's very, very entertaining. And I got so much from that at at the end of it, I went and talked to his wife and said, hi, Park Howell, I do this, I'm in marketing. I would love to interview Robert for my podcast. Well, Bernadette, I didn't even have the business of story at that time. In fact, I had no podcast. I had zilch, but I wanted to start one. So I thought, well, let's start at the top with Robert McKee. And they invited me out to their Connecticut home to sit with him in his living room and record my first ever podcast episode, which was not the business of story. He has been on my show twice since then. But I thought how generous of him to invite me out there. And here's the weird thing. You know how story is? Story takes on a life of its own. So you got to be really careful the kinds of stories you tell yourself, because if you tell bad negative stories, and bad negative stuff can happen. If you tell good positive stories, I mean, Joseph Campbell said, when you follow your bliss, doors will open where there were only walls before. And I was following my bliss and studying story. And here I found myself sitting in his living room, and I interviewed him for 3 hours. And I got so much out of that interview. It was so cool. And so it launched, I put it on SoundCloud, and then that's really what launched my interest in doing the business of story. But it came out of simply asking his wife after that conference if I could interview him. Oh, and the final thing in this is I just happened to be going out to work at IBM in New York like 2 weeks later, and that was about the only time he was available. So I flew in a day early, drove up to their Connecticut home, interviewed him, went down to IBM, and I was still fairly new to this story training thing. But there it was, exactly what Joseph Campbell said, this door open to be able to go and sit with him for 3 hours in his living room because I was fascinated in studying storytelling, and all the rest, you know, is history. So it's so interesting how that works, isn't it?
Isn't it interesting that when you put yourself out there, how things come back to you? When you take a chance on something, things come back to you. I'm a great believer in serendipity. When I began working with Seth, I was based in Perth, Western Australia. It's about the furthest away from anywhere else you could be on the planet from New York City, where Seth is. And if people ask you, sometimes people say, tell me the story of how you got there, as you did to me today. And sometimes you have to sit there and think, I honestly don't know. It was literally, there was no big plan. Like you said with Robert McKee, I didn't have a big strategic goal at the end of it. I was just there connecting to his humanity, to his wife, and just, being honest about how I felt about his work. And somehow that came back to you. Your enthusiasm and your humanity came back to you through the generosity, in generosity, and I love that.
Yeah, it's such a fun story. I don't often repeat it, but this was a good place to do it. Now, let's talk about the seven steps. Before we go away from Robert McKee, did he sign any books for you, or do you remember what he writes the same thing in his books? Because I got him to sign one for my son. Do you remember what he says? I never got a signed copy. I never asked for one, quite honestly. I didn't even think about it.
Well, you got a 3-hour interview, which was better than a signed copy of a book. But he says, write the truth. Write the truth. And
isn't that the truth?
There's something in that. Yeah, isn't there something in that for us storytellers? Like when you get to the heart of what it is, that's true.
And you think about that, Bernadette, we see it, of course, with our politicians. They'll use storytelling. They're very good storytellers typically, but a lot of times they're not telling you the truth. And it eventually comes out. And so I share that with all of my business trainees and leadership trainees. I mean, use this. It's as equally powerful for bad as it is with good. But the thing is, if you're using it for bad, it will come back to bite you. If you are telling stories that are not truth, it will eventually reveal itself. Stories convey the truth that ultimately create the trust. And so you got to use them for good, not evil.
100%.
So your 7 tips, eager to hear those. I do not know them, and I would love for my audience to hear them from you. What can we be doing to become more powerful storytellers?
Well, I've already given away 2 covertly, but the first one is to be where you are.
Presence.
To practice that presence, to practice noticing. We often have, actually, some of our story skills workshops were run at a time in COVID times when the world was completely locked down. And some people weren't going outside their homes. And they were saying, where are my stories in this? But they always found them. So being present is a key one. The ability to notice, practice noticing your life.
And can I offer something up right there, Bernadette? When you're talking, talking about
You
noticing.
can.
You talk about noticing is it's what stand-up comics do very well, right? I mean, they're constantly noticing the quirks and idiosyncrasies of humanity, and then turning it not against us, but into us so we can look at it, they reveal it to us, and we laugh. And we can get very involved in their storytelling through jokes.
Yes, one of the greatest storytellers I knew growing up was Billy Connolly, the Scottish comedian. And his skill is just to reflect back to you in real life. People, how a drunk looks walking back from the pub with a packet of fish and chips under his arm, and just being able to convey that in a way, and of course he's a brilliant communicator, just being able to convey that in a way that we go, yeah, that is us. We can laugh at ourselves. So that ability to notice is important. And that gets to one of my other tips. It's about specificity. It's, really nailing those small details that make your story come alive. That specificity that he does with the fish and chips and the gate and those kinds of little details that really make a story come alive. We talked about one of my other tips, which is giving your story a shape and a point. That doesn't mean you have to say at the end of your story, and the moral of the story is, when we tell a great story, the shape being with the story scaffold, the 5 C's: context, catalyst, complication, change, and consequence. The consequence in itself, the way we reveal the ending, is the point. We see that character's world or worldview has changed as a result of experiencing that story, and that tells us something about, like you just told the story about Robert McKee. People won't forget that the next time they're faced with a situation where they have an opportunity where they might, hold back, or will I, won't I? They'll remember Park's story about Robert McKee and how all the doors opened, even though he didn't have a podcast at the time and he had no big plan. He just followed his heart. He followed his gut instinct. So giving your stories a shape and a point is another one. And speaking your truth, speaking from the heart, saying what's true. I think there's this idea that you have to be somebody else. I think it's more prevalent now, and as social media has gathered speed, is that we're not enough as ourselves. We have to present as somebody else. And I certainly felt that when I was starting out in my business. I didn't have a degree. I didn't have an MBA. Imposter syndrome creeps in, and sometimes you feel like you've got to present to somebody else, and that was always a disaster because I can only be me. Mm-hmm. So
it's a lot easier being you, isn't it?
Well, you don't have to make it up then. You don't have to make it up. So I think if we can get over that we are enough, and our stories are enough. People don't want another Park or Bernadette or Seth Godin or Robert McKee. They want to know you and your heart.
Going back to that point about specificity, you're so right, and we are big believers in the power of story rests in the specifics. And one of the balances that our people often have is like, okay, Park, on one hand, you want me to write or tell a story with vigor, and brevity is vigor, of course. But now you're telling me you want me to be more specific. Well, isn't that just going to lengthen it out? And my point to them is it will lengthen it, but you don't have to pour on this epic specificity. It's really about word choice, about being able to, in one or two words, paint a picture, paint a feeling, express a thought or whatever. And to me, that's what you're looking for. It's like specificity is a spice, not a sauce.
100%. There are people. One of my favorite authors, if we're talking about fiction now and thinking about how specificity can work in a small work. If there are any fiction fans listening, I can recommend her work, Claire Keegan. She's an Irish author. Her latest book, Small Things Like These, was Booker listed this past year. And it's 32,000 words. She manages to tell the complete, compelling story in about a third of the words that I could do it in. My novel is 80,000 words, so it's possible. It's possible to tell small, perfect stories.
I love that. All right, so let's go through these because I know you've got a couple more. You've got practice or being present and practice noticing what's happening around you. Be in the moment because, of course, your stories are all about moments. Specificity, which we just touched on. So we're not just going on with the basic high-level story arc, but you got to take your audience to that moment so that they can picture it, they can feel it, they can smell it. They're right there with you. Shaping stories. You know, your 5C scaffolding is beautiful for that. And so you've got a point, and I guess that kind of relates back to what I had asked early on about there's got to be a bit of a strategy behind the telling of the story for that audience so that it's relevant to them in the moment. It's something they can live vicariously through and be a part of. And speaking your truth, being vulnerable, being yourself. That's 4. Do you have 3 more for us? I'm really eager to hear them.
Okay, you want them all now. Find the extraordinary in the everyday. Find the extraordinary in the everyday. Right now, Park, there's a raging thunderstorm outside my window. That's the extraordinary thing that's happening right now. So I'm sitting here on a podcast thinking, you know, how do I be present here with Park? And there's lightning and just it's like a God moment. We talked about before we came on before we started recording about you having God mode controls of this new platform you're using. Yeah. Well, I feel like the heavens have just opened here. So finding the extraordinary in the everyday.
And then what do you do with that?
Everyday, that's in the one.
What do you do when you find that? Does that inspire stories?
What I encourage people to do is it goes along with noticing is journaling it really, or taking notes. Is it your note-taking app? What is it? Those extraordinary moments in the everyday, they pass us by all the time. Use your camera, whatever it is, have some way of recording those extraordinary everyday moments because they're there. They're there.
And then you can use them in your storytelling down the road.
Because when you get to the point of thinking, I don't have anything to say, what is it? Ira Glass says, great stories happen to people who tell them. Great stories are found by people who look out for them. So we have to be on the lookout. They're not just going to land in our lap. You could have... That Robert McKee story is a bit epic, but I'm sure you've got smaller stories that could have, in your quiver that you could have forgotten if you hadn't taken notes.
Bernadette, since you're talking about weather, I've lived in Arizona. I grew up in Seattle, Pacific Northwest, where it rains all the time. It seems like, but it doesn't all the time. But that's why I moved to Arizona. We raised our kids in Phoenix. They all grew up, moved away. And my wife and I got kind of tired of that sun and that heat, and so we came up here and built a home in northern Arizona. And for the last almost 72 hours, it has either been pouring or blizzard conditions up here. And all the years that I've lived here, almost 40 years now, I have never seen so much moisture coming out of the Arizona skies for such a sustained period. So when you mentioned your storm going through there, I thought, well, that's kind of been my extraordinary moment over the last almost 72 hours because I've never seen anything like it here.
We know what that is. I'm hearing those stories, and when we shared those stories, they're pretty powerful. We're at the point now where we're all noticing the change in the climate, and whether it's my parents in Ireland or my son in Sydney or my friends in Europe, they're going, what's going on? We know what's going on.
Yeah. Climate change, definitely. Two more for us. Do you have two more tips?
What have I got?
Practice noticing, specificity.
What did we not
shaping
cover?
Stories.
Harness the power
Speaking
of the
your truth.
particular, which is the specificity.
Yeah.
I'll give you this is the introduction. This is the contents of my book, what great storytellers know. Be where you are, find the extraordinary in the everyday. So we've done that. Harness the power of the particular, which is the specificity. Speak from the heart. Stand in the audience's shoes. That's one we sort of covered, but we've touched on it. But I that goes to your intention again, doesn't it? That goes to is this story a good fit for the people that I'm speaking to? What is it that I want to communicate and convey here? How is this story a generous gift to them and not just something that's self-indulgent for me? So, standing in the audience shoes.
And what I love about your story scaffolding, those 5 C's of story, context, catalyst, complication, change, and consequence, is you can use that same structure for virtually every kind of story you're telling, right? I mean, if you're trying to tell a connection story to build trust so that people say, hey, she's just like me, or hey, I've done something similar to that, you can use that same framework. If you have to show up and you've got that moment of truth story, like, hey, man, things are changing. I know we've always done it this way, but this has changed here. And if we don't do something about that, then this is what could happen to us bad. And here's what could happen to us very good if we actually do something. So you could use that same scaffolding across the board, regardless of the story you're trying to tell or the strategy, the outcome you're trying to attain. Do I have that right?
You have that right. I wanted to create something that my parents could use, or I could use as a parent. Or one of the things I regret is not learning this sooner in my life. Do you ever think, Park, I wish I'd learned that at school, whatever it might be. I wish I'd learned this at school. I studied, at school we studied Shakespeare and Dickens, and I love Charles Dickens' stories when we studied them, but I never understood how he did it. And this was how he did it. And there was a missed opportunity there, I think, to teach children about stories. I remember my kids, when they were small, having to go into school on Monday and write about what they did at the weekend. And one of my sons wrote the same thing every week. Because he didn't want to sit down and write that, but it wasn't really storytelling, and it could have been so easily flipped for kids to empower them to be storytellers and really inhabit that feeling of, that landed. I don't mean when you're 5 or 6 maybe, but later. I wish I'd learned this skill sooner.
Yeah, it's interesting. I started playing the piano when I was 3rd grade because my grandmother played it, and I said, I want to do that. And then I was just writing little tunes my whole life. Didn't even know what I was doing. I'd hear it, I'd, know how to notate it and whatever. Well, I went on to write music for our choir in high school, and then I went on and got a degree in music composition and theory. Now, Bernadette, you got to understand, I hate performing in front of people. My wife will say, you can stand up in a crowd of 5,000 people and share storytelling, but you can't play the piano for 5 people in our living room. And I say, yes, exactly. But the thing was, I was so fascinated as to understanding, why does this music work? What do the composers know, the great composers of the classics to pop composers today? And what is it about the algorithm of music that is so powerful? So I went on to get my degree in music composition and theory. Also got a degree in communications because I figured I could make a living in advertising, but probably not as a composer. Yet I've used what I've learned throughout my ad career, and it was only in the early 2000s when I started studying story structure that I realized that my story had come full circle. The same fascination I had for why does music work, I now had the same fascination for why storytelling works. And you know what? They're almost the exact same thing. Every great piece of music follows a story structure, and every great story has a rhythm, a harmony, and a melody to it. And so I find it funny, after all of that, here I am teaching the applied science and bewitchery, or the composition of storytelling. So just like you, I can help folks that are totally uncomfortable doing it, giving them ways to do it that will work for them, that they don't have to overthink it, they don't have to become story theorists. But it's just, this is something I wished I had learned also in the 3rd grade. I think it would have revolutionized my career.
And yet, your journey has taken you to where you are now. If you'd learned it then, you wouldn't be where you are now. You wouldn't have gone along the path that you've gone along. That's what I think for myself. I didn't start writing until I was in my 40s. Somehow, I was looking at my books last night in preparation for coming to speak to you today, and it was only last night that I realized that 8 of my 11 books have got story in the title. I laughed out loud when I realized.
Seriously?
I've somehow seriously, title or subtitle. There's 8 of them, and I'm thinking, how did you do that? How did you? It was I love story, and it wasn't a strategic move at the time. All my books have to have story in the title because I want to be the storytelling guru. No, that didn't happen. That happened by accident. Just as you came in a very circuitous route to doing what you do today, through your passion, through your love, through your instinct to help other people to understand it. If there's nobody listening, you wouldn't be doing this.
Yeah. Oh, that's so true. And it has opened amazing doors for me, such as meeting Robert McKee, getting to interview Seth Godin last week, and now having you on my show. Has just been an absolute pleasure of mine. And thank you, Bernadette, for taking the time. Where can people learn more about you, your online courses, and your books?
The first link to go to is storyrepublic.com. That talks about the storytelling community I run and the online course, which is the Story Skills Workshop. And then my blog is at thestoryoftelling.com.
And are you posting regularly on your blog?
I stopped. Oh, that's another story. So I was blogging for 10 years, and I was blogging initially 5 times a week, and then 3 times a week. And then in 2019, just before COVID hit, I stopped blogging and decided I was going to be a novelist. So I published my first novel in 2022. So I don't blog as regularly as I used to, but there's a whole archive on storytelling for business there, and 11 books on Amazon if people, or wherever you get your books online for people to look at. And yeah, what great storytellers know is it contains all the lessons that we were speaking about today.
Well, that's terrific. Well, thank you so much for taking your time, and especially during that crazy thunderstorm there, to be on the Business of Story with me.
You're very welcome. I hope it didn't disturb the sound or how we came across. And thank you for the invitation. It's a thrill, Mark. It really has been a joy to chat to you.
Well, thank you. And hey, thank you all for listening or watching this actually brand new episode of Business of Story. And it's brand new in that I'm using Riverside.fm for the very first time. As you all know, this is primarily an audio show over the past 407 episodes. And so this is kicking off now that you can watch the Business of Story on YouTube. I'll be doing some live broadcasts once I really get this whole framework figured out, or this platform figured out, so I'm not blowing it on live TV out there. But Bernadette, I really appreciate it because you are my first video guest on the Business of Story, and I hope everybody out there really enjoys it. And I'd say if I can be of service to you, come on over to the Business of Story and check out the ABT course if you haven't done it yet. But therefore, Bernadette, that's the one framework I wished I had learned in the 3rd grade, because it would have made all the difference in my communication. Folks can find that at businessofstory.com/ABT. And until next week, when we will have another amazing story artist right here for you, like Bernadette, I want you to remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make sure that's an epic one. Thanks so much for watching and listening. Take care.